right, so welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. This is actually our 10th episode. Today we're going to be covering The Man in the High Castle, written by Philip Dick. He's a very famous science fiction author. Also wrote what became the movie Blade Runner. And then Amazon has also taken The Man in the High Castle and turned it into a streaming television series depicting a world in which the Axis won during World War II. So the book kind of covers what America mostly looks like in that alternate universe. And it's essentially broken up between the Japanese Empire and the German Empire. And there's a couple of characters that sort of expose what this world would look like to the average citizen. And then as they sort of go about their daily lives, you get a sense for how the governments and the regimes of the Japanese and the Germans, respectively, are running things. And there's a lot of allusions to what America used to be and what the future holds for the world. But it's a very very kind of interesting look at how politics are, in a way, very dependent on history. A lot of things are out of our control, and sort of if certain things had gone differently, then the lives of everybody is affected very profoundly. As much as we all like to believe that we all control our own lives, we're very much a product of our circumstances as well. So I think that, for me, was one of the biggest implications of the book, watching these characters sort of bounce around in these very different circumstances. But with that, I should introduce everybody. I'm joined by Ajax and Mr. Anderson, as well as Major Pinkerton, and he has a little introduction on the author. So you want to give a quick overview, Major?
Sure. Well, Philip K. Dick was born in 1928. Something very unusual about him, or unique, I should say, he had a twin sister, Jane Dick. She died at 6 weeks, and this seems like something that he wouldn't know unless people told him, but he felt like it was a trauma because, I mean, he stayed, he was still raised by his mother. He was told later on, he felt like this was the thing that affected him throughout his life, and that's something that led into this, The Man in the High Castle, as he started to wonder, like, later on in his life, what would it have been like if my twin sister had survived and I lived with her. When he was 5, his parents divorced. His mother moved to Washington, D.C. His father was in the military, and his mother won full custody of him, so she raised him the whole way. Then when he was 10, they moved out to San Francisco, to Berkeley, actually. He grew up the rest of the time there. He went to UC Berkeley for just like one semester, and they didn't diagnose panic attacks as well back then, but it sounds like what he had. He was always sickly, super nervous, having these dizzy spells. Went to UC Berkeley for one semester. He worked just for 4 years at this record store in Berkeley from 48 to 52, and that was the only regular job he ever. 22, he got his first story sold, and that's what he did for the rest of his life, even though he was totally broke most of the time.
What other works did he do that were famous, aside from, I think, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which inspired
Androids
Blade Runner?
Dream of Electric Sheep. Man in the High Castle was his first big breakout thing. Valis is a vast, alive, living intelligence system. He wrote Total Recall.
Oh, wow.
The book that Total Recall is based on, and I can't think of it at the moment, but as of a couple of years ago, at least, he's second only to Stephen King for having the most adaptations of books made into movies.
Wow, that's impressive.
And when he died, most of them were out of print. He died in 1982 at the age of 56, and then all these books got into print after Blade Runner was a big success. He died 6 months before it premiered, though he did get to see the rough cut or the early cut. And he was broke up until like the last decade of his life. He was married and divorced 5 times. He got beat a few years before writing this book in 1962 when he was with his second wife. And this book was written while he was with his third wife, and she was a jewelry maker, and that influences the book that they're making jewelry. And he lived like around the Bay Area most of his life, just like the last 10 years. He moved down to LA around Anaheim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that, based on your researching his biography, do you think that there was any reason why he wrote this book in particular? It was
Well, he
published in
was really
this.
into philosophy. He was into metaphysics, like ontology and solipsism. Another book of his called "Flow My Tears," the policeman said, it's a very similar thing. There's a guy who's a TV star, and he gets magically transported to a universe where he doesn't exist, and nobody knows who he is, and he's on the run because he doesn't have any ID or anything. So the police want to get him. So Philip K. Dick, I don't think, was coming from any sort of thing like grim, dark, ooh, how horrible could it be if the Axis had won World War II? It's really like, what if square or round and circles had corners? Just like this total, very thought experiment philosophy sort of angle. What if the universe was a different way instead of the way we take it for granted being?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, based on my reading of the book itself, he doesn't seem to have any major ideology that's at least hidden in his writing. He's basically just describing kind of a story. It doesn't seem to have too much
Yeah,
judgment
it's very
included.
matter of fact.
Yeah, yeah, very
And
much.
most of his writing was like this. It wasn't political, like, something horrible like the Hunger Games or whatever is like, oh, I'm going to hit you over the head with my ideology about this thing. It's more,
Right.
it's kind of fun. And a lot of his books had a lot of humor in them as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I should probably give a little bit more detail on sort of what transpires during the book, but I don't want to give it all away. But essentially, there's kind of an interesting, for me at least, an interplay between the native population of the Americans and the occupying populations, which are the Japanese and the Germans. And the book itself primarily takes place in San Francisco, so that's sort of in the Japanese zone. So you mostly see kind of the Americans and the Japanese, but then the Germans are sort of there on sort of business and diplomatic liaisons and things like that. And then at a later point in the book, they do travel through kind of the neutral zone between the Japanese and German sections, which is the Rocky Mountain states. So they travel up to there. And then they make a lot of allusions by talking to people on the way who are at truck stops and places like that, who are actually coming from the other direction, coming from the German occupied section of the former United States, about what that sort of part of the country looks like. And that has essentially become kind of like a province of Germany where they've redeveloped it after, of course, destroying it during the war. They had to rebuild it, and so they kind of built it up in the sort of Nazi fashion where they have autobahns and things like that, and they have these big work brigades, and there's actually a lot of respect from some people as to the efficiency of how they were able to do that. They mention Albert Speer and how he's a good planner, and he was apparently in charge of reconstructing the eastern part of the United States. And then, however, they're very brutal and tough, and they definitely don't tolerate Jews. And if you're caught being Jewish, then it's off to the camps for you. And then it's interestingly how they describe the Japanese. The Japanese, in my read, are a little bit more pragmatic, and they don't have this sort of ideological zeal that the Nazis seem to have, and so they basically just sort of treat the Western United States as basically kind of like what the British would treat like India. It was sort of like a zone to kind of like use economically, and so they have a lot of trading outposts, and they have a military presence, but it's nothing super genocidal. It's basically just, okay, you make us money, you follow our rules, and we're fine. Versus the Germans, who are much more zealous. So that was sort of what I thought was the most interesting, how they kind of contrasted the two regimes.
And another thing about the Japanese culture is he sees like their aesthetic of kind of like wabi sabi and like harmony. The Japanese want to be really peaceful and agreeable.
Right.
They don't want to like have an iron fist brute force.
Yeah,
the way the Germans do.
They're very indirect. I mean, it's kind of like I've been to Japan personally, and I've sort of seen this firsthand, and I've spoken to Japanese people and interacted with them, and there's a very high value placed on like a probrium or whatever the word is. It's basically like you don't want to come across as being um, too brutal or blunt. You want to be very subtle and elegant in how you handle things. And so they actually, in the book, the Japanese view the Germans as being kind of a little bit barbaric because they don't treat things with any elegance. They hit things with a hammer, and if it falls, great. But the Japanese will try to whittle away at something. It's much more gradual and polite form of tyranny, and so that's essentially how they govern. Um, did you guys have any questions? I can keep going with more of what I read before I do that, though. Any thoughts from the other guys?
Yeah, like the focus on the whole like axes having one thing is kind of like actually a pretty small part of the book. It's what everybody focuses on, but a lot of it is this sort of weird like Philip K. Dickian um, exploration of like views into other realities and like the possibilities of like doing magic with the I Ching, and kind of all of, as you said, all these characters flitting in and out. But the Axis having one is almost a sideshow to it. It's not like anyone is like kind of engaged in some titanic underground struggle that's gonna shake the very foundations. It's like no, there's some kind of stuff going on, but it's not really the center of the plot, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's basically just a setting in which he thinks is interesting and different enough in which he can kind of explore a story, and it's kind of like Total Recall was a very interesting setting. I mean, they're on a different planet, and they have these sort of different circumstances, and that sort of sets up the characters to do things.
Oh, A
Um,
Scanner Darkly, that was another major one that was made into a movie, and I think one of the best adaptations for like giving the feel of a Philip K. Dick book.
Yeah,
hmm.
by far that is the best. The best. It's just like a great movie in its own way.
Keanu Reeves was born to play that role, a spaced out drug dealer who doesn't.
Robert Downey Jr. in that
Oh,
movie is
he's
like
so
freaking
good.
the scene with him and the other actor whose name I forget, where they try to figure out how many gears their bicycle
Yes,
has, is like
yes, and that's
that's
in the book
worthwhile.
too.
I assume it's on YouTube.
Woody Harrelson.
Well, yeah, yeah, of
Wait,
course,
no,
Woody
yeah,
Harrelson. Yeah,
yeah. Oh, beautiful, and that's the exact same scenes in the book. That's straight from the book.
When did this come out? I completely missed this one. This is a movie?
2006. Yeah, it's a
Oh, okay.
rotoscope like Waking Life, where
Oh,
they draw the
oh,
animation.
yeah. It
oh,
was
yeah. Okay, that's
Richard
the movie.
Richard
Yeah.
Linklater
Linkletter.
who
Yes,
just like makes like one fantastic movie after another. He did that movie, I believe.
yes.
That's interesting.
The Man in the High Castle adaptation, on the other hand,
Yeah, let's talk about that because that actually I had a brief period where I subscribed to or I didn't subscribe. I signed up for the free promotion from Amazon to do Prime, and they with that they include their streaming service, and so I saw very prominently the Man in the High Castle promotion, but I didn't watch it out of sort of protest because I had a feeling that there'd be some sort of like, unlike the book, perhaps a little bit more political meaning behind the adaptation of it. So I didn't want to get dissuaded of my views based on what Hollywood wanted me to believe. But have any of you actually seen it? Because I've heard things
I
about it.
watched
But
the complete first season, and I think it's back in a. I don't know. I keep seeing ads for it, so I assume it's back pretty soon.
yeah. So what type
Well,
of storyline did they follow? Is it at all like the book, or is it something else?
they sort of turn it into this whole like resistance story thing,
Yeah, that's
that
what I
like
Of
thought.
that's
course.
yeah, the whole there is this the sort of the hook that is taken from the book, that there are these films that depict these alternate realities, which actually in the book don't correspond to our like the way that things went down, like quote unquote, in our timeline. But I believe in the show, it's just a direct analogy. And yeah, they add a bunch of stuff, of course, because they have to flesh out the entire miniseries, and they're not going to do like whole digressions on the I Ching. They spend like a lot of time like oy veying about like did you know the Nazis were bad, and like, oh, it's Sunday, we have to go kill the cripples. Lots of that sort of thing. Like, oh, like you're a high-ranking SS officer, and like your child has a heart defect that we discovered at age 15 or whatever. Well, we're Nazis, so got to kill him too.
Yeah.
They do a lot of kind of I guess motif setting of like evil Nazis.
Well, it's kind of hard to beat Wolfenstein: The New Order. I don't see why they, it's going to get old eventually. It's not going to be able to make any more money at some point.
Well, I thought peak Nazi was when they put the Nazis on the moon, whatever that movie was called, Iron Sky.
That was
I think is what it was.
cheap, though. That was meant to be funny.
That was pretty good. Like the whole like Nazi moon base ethos is actually pretty nice, because like all of that technology was stuff U.S. Apollo program, which is basically just like Werner von Braun like continues the Nazi rocketry project with American Industrial Base. Like none of that is really stuff that like should have been possible at that time. So it fits very well with this kind of almost quasi steampunk future in the past sci-fi aesthetic.
Well, Mr. Anderson, why did you want to watch that series?
I mean, so I've read a lot of Philip K. Dick, and it's actually he's one of my favorite authors. So I feel like you gotta see some of the adaptations when they come out. Mm-hmm. Now, why did I not pull the eject lever halfway through the season? That's probably just a moral failing on my part.
You just couldn't stop enjoying the aesthetics.
I love the pain.
Yeah, no. If anyone is unfamiliar, they also had their notorious advertising campaign.
Oh, it was fantastic! In the subways.
They depicted I think the subtitle is like, "What if they won?" or something.
What if we lost?
Oh yeah, what if we lost?
We did lose.
Big time.
The visual punchline for this was a happy Aryan-looking family sitting around a dinner table with two well-behaved, well-dressed blonde children, dad in his suit, and mom setting down a turkey or whatever. It's like the horrors.
Yeah, with a
and the dog has a swastika on his collar.
Yeah, there was a dog one, the golden I saw on Twitter.
And the girl's doll is hailing victory as well.
That's perfect. These little touches of alternate reality are what really make the genre.
It's a
worthwhile.
Good thing history turned out the way it is. I'll tell you that much. I look out my window and I say, "Thank God we won that war. Things could have been horrible otherwise."
Well, it's interesting that so most of the sort of like what if the Nazis won, like what if the South won the Civil War, etc. They all seem to focus kind of on a time frame that's like pretty close to the event in question. Like the Man in the High Castle is set in the 1960s.
1962.
Yeah, so it's close enough that you still have like veterans running around. You still have sort of a lot of the same stuff in there. Like you have like basically at most kind of one regime. So it's very focused on kind of the proximate changes, but it actually kind of avoids looking at some of the more structural things that would be kind of interesting to contemplate what would have happened had that event gone the other way.
Does he spend much time explaining how the United States lost the war to the point where they would be occupied and divided?
Yes. Oh, go ahead if you
No,
want.
no, yeah, I think you probably remember better than me, so please go
Well,
ahead.
so the FDR got assassinated in 1940. So the depression. So in his reality, the depression continued, and it didn't go. The depression continued, and so the U.S. wasn't nearly as mobilized when it had to enter into the Second World War, and the World War II stretched all the way to 1947, and the U.S. never got the atom bomb. Those are the main things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Leading to continue. Yeah, that's the main problem. So the Japanese. Yeah.
It just seems implausible that, I mean, it's fine. You know, you want to have a story about this sort of scenario, so you just sort of wave your hands and say that they took the country over. But it's just from a sort of stickler's perspective, it's hard to imagine the United States, you know, losing to the point where they had to literally surrender and be occupied. You know?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. I mean,
Philip K. Dick was never a hard sci-fi guy. He was always very kind of like squishy about that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's fine. You know, that's just me being a stickler. But I can't imagine, you know, a country of whatever it was, like 140 million people, most of whom had rifles with 2 oceans for defense, losing to the point where we would be occupied by like a Germany and a Japan that would be overstretched as it was.
right. No, I mean, I
Yeah.
think we sort of outnumber them, you know, in population and land mass and oceans, you know, and just everything you just mentioned. It is logistically ridiculous, and so of course I agree with you. But I think it's interesting that they would even produce a television series that postulates that this is sort of like a, oh my gosh, we were so lucky to avoid this potential scenario.
Well, did you know the Nazis were bad?
I haven't heard that. I needed
It's
to
very
see.
important we share this message to the young kids. They get all these
Yeah.
positive message about the Nazis in school. We need to do a TV series. The cripples get burned on Tuesday. They're really mean. They're so nasty. They have dinners together. They sit down at the table. It's horrible.
Well,
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, because they were, as we, some of our earlier episodes, I mean, we did kind of show, I think, that they weren't necessarily, you know, they were rough customers, to be sure. But yeah, it's interesting that they just sort of make this enormous leap, and it makes sense, you know, because it's a great way to further build on this 70-year trend of the Third Reich. It's more and more like comic
Cartoonish.
book. Yeah, cartoonish. Yeah, I was going to say comic book, but yeah, cartoonishly evil.
Have you
Yeah, they
seen
go
the,
from.
Have you seen the
they go from-
cutscenes? Oh, sorry.
So, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Have you seen the cutscenes from Wolfenstein: The New Order?
No, I don't know anything about it.
So you know that was a big hit, right? A couple years ago, the new Wolfenstein game.
No, last I knew was the id Software one from like
Okay.
1990.
The 2 years ago, they came out with a new Wolfenstein game. Big, huge hit. It's like absolute. There's some scenes in it that's like they'd almost make you throw up. There's like this Mengele guy is the bad guy. He's cutting people open. They're just like, it's absolutely ridiculous. Like people talk about it on the forum. It's not supposed to be funny though. It is like if Warhammer 40K were trying to be really serious. Like all the Nazis do is torture and kill, and it's just absurd.
well, I just think all of this media demonstrates how little the American public actually understands about World War II and what the numbers were basically showing in that war, that Germany and Japan as well were completely outgunned, and this scenario is completely ridiculous. But the fact that people are willing to buy it and watch it and talk about it with their friends and as some sort of like legitimately possible scenario, and oh my God, you know, you better not vote for Trump because it's going to come back if we don't. It just shows how much brainwashing there is in this country and throughout the world, because, you know, remember, Hollywood is basically a pipeline to most media outlets around the the entire planet. So that's to me one of the more interesting things about how this type of story gets taken into a major media format and sold and successfully. So I guess they're making a second season now. You said, Mr. Anderson.
Yes, I believe they've already made the second season. They're just going to release it into a hostile release it into Trump's America to remind us of how things could have gone.
Yeah, heaven forbid. Um, so let's see, what else can we discuss? There was a lot of mysticism in this book, which I frankly had no patience for. I just skipped over that
Ooh,
stuff.
you're in the wrong neighborhood if you are reading Philip K. Dick with no taste for mysticism.
Hey, I read it. I read it for the Third Reich stuff. So, you know,
The
it wasn't.
So
lulz.
Yeah.
this is the same author who sort of he I think it was Valis. I want to
Yeah,
say it was
Vallis.
Val. Where there's a Russian author whose name I forget who had this hypothesis that he had read that basically the Roman Empire never really fell, and it's like quote unquote really the year around like 1500 or so.
90 AD.
Yes, and we are somehow like simultaneously living in present times and in the early apostolistic apostolic, yeah,
Apostolic.
apostolic Christianity. So, I mean, this is this notion of kind of like overlaid realities is like a recurring theme of Dick's.
Yeah. What does
So you
apostolic
said he
mean?
did drugs,
You
is
guys?
that right?
Oh,
Well,
yeah,
no,
I feel
the
like
main drug he didn't do the psychedelics. He was really just speed. He did a lot of speed, and like when it was in pill form. And it was actually his father-in-law of his second wife. I mean, he was sickly always as a kid. He was one of these really like, really sickly guys, just naturally not a very strong constitution. So his father-in-law of his second wife said, Here, Phil, have some of this speed. This'll keep you going." And he was doing that for a long time, and then got worse and worse and worse. But then managed to kick it. He was in a Synanon type thing.
Yeah, it wasn't so much the drugs. Like he was also somewhat. I, I don't. The diagnosis is unclear. Like especially once you start mixing in amphetamine psychosis, but there was probably a little bit of schizophrenia going on there, or some form of like manic depression, or just kind of a little bit of everything because it's it's the 60s/70s.
Well, I really think he was agoraphobic. He didn't like to leave the house, and it got worse over time. He was really holed up in his house, and it wasn't just like paranoia. He would have these episodes that sound a lot like panic attacks, even when he was younger. He liked to stay in his home. He was a very, very sensitive guy in a lot of ways. And he needed a lot of like emotional support. And that's what all his wives said, is they didn't like that he was so needy. He really needed people to comfort him, and very insecure, very neurotic guy. But a lot of people liked him as well. But he had a lot of issues, to be certain. He had a lot of depression. He was bedridden, depression very often in his life.
But he did like personally have like these mystical experiences as well. Like his like Valis is like semi-autobiographical kind of like the main character is horse lover fat, which is like kind of a literal translation. Philippos in Greek is horse lover, and Dick means fat in German. And I guess both of these characters, like Philip K. Dick and horse lover fat, had this experience where like they answer the door and they're hit with like a pink laser that tells them these deep truths of the universe, including that like his son has cancer or something, or a heart defect. That then turned out to be the case in his telling. So yeah, he's pretty. He's got a lot of kind of semi like the same motifs that he was writing about, he was like experiencing for some extent personally.
Oh yeah, yeah. But that was a lot later in his life. He was writing about all this stuff earlier on, before he had the Valis experience.
What do you guys think of a world in which this sort of scenario actually unfolded? Do you think, let's just put aside for the fact that it was incredibly unlikely given the odds that the Axis was up against, but what do you think of a world in which this actually happened? Do you think it would be good or bad, or in what way?
Kind of depends how it happened, to be honest.
So you're like, what is the cost of the outcome, or what is the outcome itself? What do you mean?
Both of those.
Uh-huh.
If if the Axis just kind of win in 1940 by default, then well, for one, there's probably no Holocaust, which is a nice little a troll, but a
right.
pretty accurate one.
Yeah,
like
that's not what the book portrays, but I tend to agree with you. But yeah, I mean,
yeah,
the book
Right,
itself,
Madagascar.
it was the book itself was essentially what I think Hollywood today teaches you what the Germans were about, which was genocidal by nature, and so it is not what you're describing, which is more of a nationalist movement of just leave us alone kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I can believe that there's like, forced exile essentially, or like, reservations, or, any number of things. But, you only, you typically this like phenomenon of like concentration camps or like death camps, to whatever extent that you believe that, is like symptomatic of like being a losing side in a war and having a population that you see as a problem that you need to get rid of as quickly as possible.
Well, what also intrigued me about the book, now, do you guys offhand know when it was published? Because the storyline takes place in 1962.
It was published in 1962.
Okay, perfect. So my sort of post David Cole, let's put it that way, understanding of the Holocaust is that the Holocaust narrative didn't really develop until the 70s. But this book, if it was published in the early 60s, and written probably, who knows, late 50s, I don't know, if he's sort of intimating that there was sort of this gas chamber stuff going on, that tells me otherwise. That tells me that there was sort of a narrative about this stuff going on, and maybe there was more credence to it. I don't know. But what do you guys
here's
think?
A fun fact. Fun fact, guys. The wife that he was married to, his third wife, when he wrote this book.
Yeah.
Guess the last name.
It's
Rubenstein.
There you go.
Rubenstein.
Yeah.
That was my second guess.
There's a fantastic thread on MPC, my posting career, wherein they discuss the hypothesis that the androids in Blade Runner are fundamentally like representative of Jews. It's a good read.
I think that's something Greg Johnson wrote as well. It was on Countercurrents, or maybe even Radix. I can't remember.
Why would they be Jews? Because they were artificial by nature. They were manufactured. It was sort of like
they're shapeshifters who feign emotion.
They can't have empathy, but they can pretend to have empathy. Okay. But they're all psychopaths by nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, how much of that was his the influence of his wife, versus his like how much of that was driven by his own interpersonal issues with his wife, versus like a robust hypothesis.
Here's another thing: is I think he knew. I mean, he grew up in Berkeley mainly. He obviously he must have met a fair amount of Jewish people. And I read another book from even earlier in his career. These characters are explicitly Jewish. This guy, the main character, is usually just a stand-in for PKD himself. And in this book, he writes that the main American character is talking to his friend, who's making the fake jewelry, and he says, well, I know you can. I know you can create it. And this was the first time I'd ever heard this. The Frink,
Right.
he says you could make this. It's like the myth. The stereotype is that Jews can only imitate; they can't create. But I know you can create, and that was the first time I'd heard that. It was like 3 or 4 years ago. I'm just like, I'd never heard that before.
Well, they make that point about the Asian ability as well. They're extremely good imitators, but they can't create. And I think there was maybe some hidden meaning behind having the Jewish character start up this jewelry company. But what he did do that was sort of dishonest was he tricked a store owner under false pretenses to kind of start this strange cascade to get funding from this guy. And I won't go into the details, it doesn't matter. But essentially he was committing fraud, or at least deceiving somebody. And that was sort of a character trait that was built into this Jewish character that was shown. Sorry, Ajax, go ahead.
I was going to say, to go back to your question about when did the Holocaust narrative get nailed down.
Yeah.
I think it wasn't propagated until the 70s, but even at the end of the war, I'm pretty sure I've seen like newspaper headlines where they had like the 6 million figure like ready to go, like almost too quickly.
Yeah, I mean they were saying that stuff before the
in the
war.
1920s. They
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the New York Times was pushing this narrative pretty hard.
Part of Jewish numerology, 6 million.
Yeah,
it's been floating around since the 1800s.
Numerology. Everything is part of it.
Isn't there alphabet? Doesn't it like double as the numbers or something like that? I don't know. I saw the movie Pi, so that's my only reference.
Yeah,
to that.
well, there is a very specific numerology to the Hebrew alphabet.
Yeah, I believe it. They're good counters and lenders, so I'm sure that's part of their culture. So I don't know. I mean, okay, let's say this actually is what the world looks like. Do you guys think that the characterization of the different peoples in the book, for those of you who have read it at least, is fair, or is it accurate, including the Americans? And I can kind of go into that if you guys want me to a little bit more. But from what I understand, I mean, it's sort of the only thing you probably don't know if you haven't read the book is that the Americans are sort of portrayed, I think, as they would be if sort of another country had taken over. They're not really a people per se. It's just sort of a conglomeration of different groups of people, and so they kind of go with whatever the regime in power is pushing. So in other words, it's not a nation; it's just sort of a country, and they're kind of ashamed and resigned to being the losers of the war. Whereas the Japanese and the Germans, they have much more deep kind of cultural characteristics that are exhibited. But for those of you who have read it, at least, do you think that their characterization in the book was fair? Was it accurate of the peoples themselves?
Well, the Japanese in the book, especially the young couple, the main character. So the main character, for anyone who hasn't read it, he's an antique dealer, and he goes to a house call, this young couple, because they want to look through all his wares. They're having him over for dinner, and they're super nice to him. And as we said before, the thing of like the Japanese politeness, everything being kind of restrained and subdued, that's a major thing. And the Japanese people in the book, almost all of them are like really pretty placid unless something really upsetting happens. They seem very like calm and contained. And that seems accurate from what I know. I've never been, but I've watched a lot of Vice documentaries about Japan, so I'm pretty,
I thought it was very accurate. I've been to Japan more than once. It was very accurate on the Japanese side. What did you think about the German portrayal?
Well, there's just a couple of characters that come over. As it said, it was kind of cartoonish. I think there were like, so we say this didn't get propagated massively until like the 70s, but I think there was like circles that there were these rumors and like word of mouth stories that were getting spread around before then. before, like, it was on in the movies and on TV. Just a thought. And of course, there were no shortage of Jewish people in the Bay Area at that time that he would have been in touch with.
Yeah. There was an interesting character, I thought, from the German side in the book that I think bears mentioning. He was posing as a Swedish businessman, and he kind of flies into on the rocket ship. They have rocket ships that basically are kind of like 45 minutes from Berlin to New York or something. But he flies in on this thing, and he gets off Lufthansa, and he's there on a trade mission. And so he shows up at the San Francisco trade office where there's some Japanese guy meeting him, and it's ostensibly about this piece of equipment. I can't remember the details exactly, but it's basically just it's like, okay, you know, we want to see your technology. Let's set up a deal. Blah blah blah. But what you get is these hints that he's not what he seems, and he's basically his first interaction with somebody in the book is on the plane, and he's actually arguing with a German flight attendant, and the guy is talking about this and that, and he says something that is very sort of racially charged, and so he's kind of speaking of the kind of racial theories that are sort of encouraged in the Nazi ideology, and it kind of is so extreme, and he says something that's a little bit offensive to the Swedish, the guy's pretending to be Swedish, that the guy sort of tries to scare him, and he basically says, you know, I'm actually Jewish, because he was saying something that was anti-Jewish, the flight attendant was, and he says, I'm actually Jewish, but I'm very high up, and I work for the Secret Service, and I'm going to actually, when I get back, I'm going to tell them that you just said that, and you're going to have a very miserable life going forward, and you know, unless you back down. And I think he basically was just bullshitting him because he was just trying to get at this guy. But later in the book, you're led to believe that he's actually a German agent or an officer for the intelligence service, and he's been working through a back channel with the Japanese to warn them about this big plot that one of the factions in the German regime is planning to basically nuke the Japanese islands. And he's sent on this sort of cover mission to kind of warn the Japanese to intervene in the German government to pick the faction that's against this plan, which is essentially going to blow the whole world up, I guess. But my question is, you know, is he one of these three things? I mean, it's clearly he's not a Swedish businessman, but is he actually Jewish, or is he German? And then what do you guys think about kind of like how much honesty is in sort of, or how much does Philip K. Dick tell you? Because I remember when Blade Runner came out, there was a big sort of debate as to whether or not Harrison Ford's character, I can't remember his name, but Harrison Ford's character, Deckard, yeah, exactly, whether he was an android or not. And I think Ridley Scott says, yeah, he was an android, but he didn't write the book. So what do you guys think about it? He's not in the book. He's not in the book. Okay, so
no. There's this whole other plot line that's much more interesting to me, but yeah. No, he's not.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't read Blade Runner, or the book that was used to make Blade Runner, but in Man the High Castle, do you guys think that this particular guy is Jewish? Is he working under some sort of like 4D chess move to kind of like upset the Germans by posing as a German who's posing as a Swedish guy? Do you guys have anything to speculate on that?
I thought it was just like Philip K. Dick just throwing out, not a red herring, but whatever, just something novelty, because the guy even says, I've had surgery, I've had plastic surgery, right, so that I look Nordic, right, instead of Jewish. It's like, okay, yeah, well, you know, like raised eyebrows, really?
I don't know. It's possible.
I think based on my recollection, it was pretty clear that he was fucking with him.
I think so too. I just wanted to ask the question.
I think so.
Yeah. Because I mean, if you let's just say that if you believe that he was Jewish, that would sort of imply that the Jews are tough people. You know, they can kind of like actually work that deep and within a regime that actually is explicitly genocidal against them. Not even.
But yeah,
like,
that's the. I think that's the the in joke that your conceptualization of Jews as these shape shifting power broker puppet masters, and surprise goyim, I myself am Jewish and a power broker and etc.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I thought it was interesting. And then the other Jewish character in the book, and he's also married to a goy, which is an interesting sort of setup.
A shiksa.
Yeah. Who's described as libidimus or something like that. I don't know. He had a very kind of funny way of describing how she looked, but she's kind of very sultry looking, curvy, I guess. Anyway, she comes into play later in the book, but this Frank guy, who's the jeweler, he's there's no sort of speculation otherwise. He's Jewish, but he has to hide the fact that he is from the Germans, but he's allowed to be Jewish. It's sort of understood by people who know him, at least, that he's Jewish in the Japanese region, being San Francisco. That's the place he's in. But when he is caught up in sort of this big conspiracy, inadvertently on his part at least, to be found to be doing something illegal, they use his Jewishness to kind of throw him in jail, and so his characterization is kind of interesting too. And I think my previous question to you guys would be applied to him as well. Do you think his portrayal as a Jewish American, at least, is accurate, and that he is a craftsman, and he had kind of this strange neurotic relationship with his ex-wife, and he then tries to find honest work, but he can't, so then he ends up cheating this guy. And I don't know. I mean, I'm showing a little bit of a bias in my description of him, but what did you guys think of his characterization? Was he a victim, or did he deserve what he got, kind of thing?
Something to me, when the first time I read it, I thought he was okay. He's very, I mean, that guy in particular wasn't a stand-in for Philip K. Dick, but like I said, Philip K. Dick was married and divorced 5 times in his life. A lot of his main characters in other books, especially, what's the one that has to do with Perky Pat? 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Yeah, super good.
Yeah, and Mr. Anderson, would you agree that a lot of, the protagonist is almost always Philip K. Dick, and he knew it at the time, that he's writing about himself, he's this guy, he's neurotic, he has trouble with relationships, he's very needy, he's very anxious, that's a very common thing for his protagonists?
Yeah, and he does this thing also that you see in a lot of kind of high volume writers, shall we say, of the 50s through 70s, where a lot of his books, if you read enough of them, there's about maybe 20 plot elements, and it's permutations of about a half dozen of those in any given book, and yeah, the neurotic kind of author stand-in is one of those for sure.
And then in another book, Voices from the Street, which was about his working at the music store, and maybe some other books. This is the only one that I've read that it's that there's this character who is Jewish, who is by himself, who is so sympathetic. Because in other books they have this guy and he's not Jewish. He doesn't know how to do any sort of scheme. He's just tends to have really bad luck, and he goes on these misadventures, but he doesn't know how to scheme. But this is different in that this guy sets up this fraud that he can make this money for fake jewelry and do this stuff. But I think he felt some sort of kinship with the Jewish stereotype of being neurotic and kind of a weakling because he was never, or handsome guy. He was never a laborer or an athlete or anything.
I agree with that. I don't think he portrays him that negatively, to be honest. Aside from the fact that he cheated, I think he was portrayed more as a victim. If and I think he sympathizes with this fellow. So the theory that that's his sort of personification in written form is, I think, fairly accurate. If you were going to pick a character, I think that would be Philip K. Dick's personification. And there were a couple other characters we could discuss. There was a truck driver, which I thought was interesting. I don't know how much of the story I should give away, but he basically is not what he says he is, and he's part of a greater plot to set in motion some big things, and his sort of characterization is maybe perhaps what we could talk about if you guys want to. Okay, that's idea number one. Idea number two, they do describe sort of the Nazi Party a lot. They go into detail onto the different higher-ups who are in the running for potentially taking over the government because the current I don't know what they call them. Yeah, Bormann, but I wanted to say, yeah, Chancellor, or Fuhrer, whatever the word they use, but yeah, Chancellor's probably right. He dies, and I guess Hitler had died earlier. I can't remember why.
No, he didn't. He didn't die. He had advanced syphilis, which is another rumor. Certain people wanted to spread about him,
right?
Yeah. But there are maybe some evidence, whatever. He's convalescent. So he's been out of commission for like a decade.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So yeah, he's not the chancellor anymore. So it's Bormann, and for reminder to everybody, Bormann was Hitler's secretary, but he essentially was kind of like what in the United States we'd call the chief of staff. Like he was in charge of running the appointments and everything. So he wasn't just sitting at a desk answering the phone. He was actually very important. So Philip K. Dick saw him as sort of very close to Hitler, and kind of interesting as to why he thought he would be the next chancellor, as opposed to somebody like Goering, who is also fairly prominent in history. But anyway, that's topic two as a potential. Anybody else have anything? I'm looking through my notes, but you guys want to discuss anything?
Oh, I thought something really interesting was okay, another spoiler warning. Whatever, too bad. This Japanese character who's an executive.
Tagomi, the main guy in the building.
Yeah, Tagomi. He's the client of the American antiques dealer.
Right.
And he buys one of the American antiques dealer's pieces of jewelry that's actually fake because he sees like this magic energy coming from it. He picks it out. And then he goes for a walk, and suddenly, magically, he's transported to the 1962 our world, San Francisco. And he's just horrified. Everything looks so incredibly ugly to him, and he walks into this diner, and he says he wants to sit down. And in his world, a Japanese person gets priority at a counter. And he says, "I insist." And this guy is like, "What the fuck you want?" Mm-hmm. And he walks over to, along the Embarcadero the freeway used to run. Like before, what was it, the 92 earthquake?
89, yeah.
89. And it didn't rebuild it. And he's like, "What the hell is that?" He says to a police officer. He's like, "Oh, yeah, that's the new freeway. A lot of people don't like it. They think it really ruins the view." Oh, well. And what's really funny to me is so when that was written in 62, there was that big ugly freeway, and like you ever seen the movie Bullet, the whole Embarcadero looked nasty.
Yeah.
At that point in time. But then fast forward 50 years later, it collapsed in an earthquake. They decided, no, we shouldn't rebuild it. It doesn't look good. It's not a good place to put it. And now we don't have it anymore. For that reason, that the Japanese wouldn't want to do big crazy autobahns and clutter up a city and have ugly architecture and stuff like that. I just thought
Well,
that was an interesting
no, it
point.
is actually interesting that he portrays it that way because the Japanese today, if you go to Japan, are actually very infrastructure happy um, for a couple reasons. But historically, they weren't like that. I mean, if you look at the part of Japan that was not hit by the American firebombers specifically during the war, which actually a lot of people don't even understand, that it did a lot more damage in Tokyo alone from the firebombing from all the B-29 raids than the two atomic bombs combined ever did.
Yeah, like more than 10 times or.
Yeah, just some population loss and area destroyed and all that stuff. And so Tokyo itself is actually completely rebuilt. I mean, the city doesn't look anything like a Japanese city would prior to the war, with a few exceptions because they didn't hit the Imperial Palace, which is, quite architecturally stunning. And that was probably one of the reasons, but they also probably didn't want to kill the emperor so that he would maybe surrender. But that's where the emperor lives. But my point was that the Japanese historically are very sort of refined in their architectural tastes, but these days not so much. And maybe Philip K. Dick didn't foresee that they would kind of essentially kind of try to become Americans and outdo Americans as sort of a way to secure their own freedom.
But I've read a theory about that is that that's a part of the reason. It's it's a psychological theory that's part of the reason for the Japanese obsession with technology, is because in World War II they were behind, and that's
well, it goes back further than that. If you if you look at their history, they actually were isolated until the Americans, as it were, came in, and I think it was 1849, maybe 50, but around that point, give or take a couple years, where they sent in this guy named Admiral Perry, and he brought in his battleships, or whatever they were called back then, but essentially these big naval forces into Tokyo Bay, and he basically said, "Hey, you guys have to trade with us," because prior to that, Japan was pursuing isolationism. They didn't have any foreigners. They didn't trade with people, with the exception of a couple of places. I think in Nagasaki they would trade with the Dutch. They had this little quarter where they would let the Dutch traders come in, and they also had a little Chinatown there. But aside from that, it was completely isolated. They didn't allow any foreign influence. And then when the Americans showed up, I guess they didn't have a choice. I mean, they had to accept trade envoys or something like that. And after that, the Japanese government, they pursued a crash course in industrialization. They actually tried to catch up after that point. So it goes back actually 100 years prior to World War II, where they were trying to compete with the West. And that's probably why they had such a huge advantage over the Chinese in the campaigns they were leading. I think in the early 30s, prior to the German invasion of Poland. They were in Manchuria even before that, and so they had a very strong technological edge over everybody else. So it goes back much further with the technological obsession. But this infrastructure stuff didn't quite take hold until I think after the war, because I mean everything was blown up. So I guess that's part of why they did it. But yeah, Japan is a interesting case study in kind of what happens after society gets blown up. Because in Germany, they kind of had to do the same thing. They had to rebuild, and in a lot of ways, they're very similar to the Japanese and the way they went about it. And of course, the American presence over there and in Japan is also interesting as well. But I'll stop. I'll let you guys talk. What do you guys think?
The blog.gym hypothesis about Japan, that essentially after we conquered them, we destroyed their society with feminism, has always been an intriguing point of contrast with the.
I think that's more true in Germany than in Japan, to be honest with you. The Japanese, really don't have a whole lot of female representation in leadership roles. Now they've been, being persuaded to do that by publications like The Economist for years. But if you just look at their parliament building, I mean, they have some females, but they don't have a lot. And the same holds true in business leadership circles. But in Germany, yeah, they do. Feminism has taken hold there.
They have a very low. The Japanese have a very low birth rate, though that might have something to do with just lack of space on that small island.
That's an interesting topic. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure what it is, but it's not a matter of the place being too dense. All the most prosperous countries,
Yeah.
like you take just the white part of America included, it's pretty low. You take Russia, it's low. Germany actually has the lowest in the world for the birth rate. But all the prosperous populations, and Japan is really the one non-white country that can be lumped in in terms of like technological progress, prosperity, GDP, that, and South Korea. And it's a similar phenomenon across the board. Way lower birth rates. It's really acute in Japan for some reason, but it's very similar in Europe, throughout the West.
Well, a lot of it.
Right, and the West has feminism.
And here's the thing: is Japan doesn't have much in the way of immigration compared to America. So people don't say, "Oh, dwindling birth rates in America is because we all have the wonderful Mexicans coming and having 15 children." But Japan doesn't have any steady flow of immigrants coming from anywhere.
They don't view it as necessarily as a dire situation as maybe those of us in the West do, because they do have control over their immigration. And so there's a very kind of positive view on automation there. And essentially, if you just sort of forget that GDP growth is an automatic positive for your society, and you remember that per capita GDP is probably more important, I think that they're actually on an okay course, because they will remain Japanese and they're not going to disappear. And they have also a very low unemployment rate. I mean, we forget that. It's like, why are we constantly bringing in surplus labor when we already have 95 million unemployed, or out of work, I should say, because the classification is screwed up today. But the people who are not working in the United States is 95 million, and that's almost like a third of the country, which is ridiculous. And in Japan, I think it's probably 5%, maybe 10% if you use our sort of accounting method, but it's very low, very, very low. And that's a good thing. That's good for social harmony, and they certainly have low crime rates and everything.
Right. In the U.S., if you look at labor force participation rates for men by age cohorts over time, we're at basically an all-time low.
Yeah.
In terms of labor force participation of 50-year-old men, 30-year-old men, however you look at it, it's very low.
Yeah, it's not good. It's psychologically, spiritually, it's just damaging. And I think long-term economically, it's very damaging. I mean, they say, if you don't have people in the workforce for a certain amount of time, I mean, it permanently disables their ability to do anything productive throughout the rest of their life. So anyway, we're kind of drifting off maybe the book itself, but I think the book exposes kind of an interesting world where we can kind of talk about these issues, which I think are important. Let's see. I'm looking at my notes again. Well, let's talk about Germany real quick, because we just mentioned Japan and maybe the effects of feminism. Because, I mean, feminism and the people behind feminism, if you want to go that route, are kind of blamed for a lot of this stuff in the West. But I think Japan maybe is sort of a proof that it's not necessarily feminism per se. It's more, technology, maybe birth control, things like that. And
decadence, some would say. Though that doesn't have a super exact definition.
Yeah, China has the same problem. So does South Korea. I mean, it's essentially, I think what it is basically any country or people or culture that has sort of K versus R selection, if you guys know about that theory. They want to emphasize high quality offspring as opposed to high quantity offspring with low quality. And so with that, and you have a very sort of very high cost of living country, you don't necessarily want to have a lot of kids because you can't afford them and you can't set them up to be successful if you do have a lot. And so I've talked to Japanese people and read kind of some of the writing, and they basically say that after, especially the I think it was 1990, basically, when their stock market started imploding and their sort of boom, which is in many ways similar to what China has right now, started to collapse and their bubble started deflating. There was a big chill put on the population as to whether or not they could have kids. And I don't know if that's completely accurate because, I mean, again, China, whose economy is still booming, at least on paper, has the same demographic issues. However, they also have a one-child policy. So I don't know. I mean, it's just all these theories, you know, if you put them in different circumstances, they sort of are tested. And so I don't know. I mean, let's...
Well, you can... this is like kind of completely going off the rails of Man in the High Castle, but you can look at sort of the prescriptions that are given when you have various NGOs talk about the birth rates in these countries, and they have like a fairly reliable recipe of economic development, empowerment of women, increased trade, increased specialization. Basically, like most aspects of modernity, as we like experience it kind of in a westernized society, seem to crater birth rates. And the only kind of outstanding question is to what extent you can have like a functioning, modernized, economically productive society and also maintain reasonably high birth rates.
Yeah, the Russia currently, as far as I know, has the highest birth rate in Europe. It's still below replacement. I think it's 1.7, 1.8 per woman over a lifetime. That's the current estimate. They are sort of seem to be fumbling in the dark toward a package of policies that correct the birth rate and move it up to replacement.
Are you sure about that number? Because
yeah, it's moved up a lot in recent
years. Yeah,
because
as recent as like maybe 10 years ago, I remember reading like their population was
really
projected
bad.
to kind of disappear, you know, in 200 or
they've
something
really
like
turned
that.
it around.
Yeah. Okay.
They've essentially what they've done is and a lot of these are new policies. Like they've recently increased. So I mean, we'll see what we can get out of it. But you know, they've massively funded the Orthodox Church and you know had children study Christianity in school. They've I mean, and whether or not you're a believer is sort of besides the point. I mean, that is a kind of a proven cultural technology for promoting fertility.
Yeah.
They've outlawed or they've really blocked internet pornography.
Wow.
So at least to make it harder to find internet pornography. That's a brand new policy, so I don't think that's baked into the numbers yet. That's like a month-old policy. And they have offered subsidies for every child you have after number one. Yeah, after your first child, you get something like, I don't know, quite a bit of money for Russia, actually. Like one-time payment of like, what the hell was it? I think someone told me it was like 500,000 rubles. It almost sounds like too much, though.
Right.
Yeah, the tricky part of looking at population statistics is that everything is kind of on a delay pedal. So you can look at two countries that have like identical reproductive rates in terms of like the current lifetime like children per person or per woman, I guess, equivalently. But if you have a difference in their like average age at first reproduction, then like you have completely different population dynamics. You also have like cohort issues where you're basically the cohort that started to be born after the fall of the USSR is now like in their prime kind of reproductive ages. So you can have these things where you have like a huge die off of people, um, or just like falling out of the kind of like reproductive cohort, or people who are like 30 without a kid when the USSR fell. They're just not having kids. So everything looks really terrible for 10 years until you have like a younger cohort kind of come in. Ideally, they pop out kids immediately, and then everything is able to rally in pretty short order.
What do you guys think about the value of having a growing population versus one that actually is just left to its own devices, where it's adjusting to the circumstances? That's sort of like the free market, invisible hand approach, perhaps, provided that maybe you don't have massive immigration to subvert your nationhood. So it's basically like, what Japan is set up to do versus what Germany is doing. What do you guys think of this, or Russia?
Um, it sort of depends. Like right now, most countries are pretty far, or most developed countries are pretty far from the Malthusian limit. But you'd think eventually you're going to just, it's almost like axiomatic, that eventually in a centuries timescale, you're going to breed a population that will look like India insofar as like you're going to take up
Yeah,
every last square spot of arable land, and
yeah,
people are going to be living on top of each other. So I think actually at a certain point, I mean, you want to have a demographic reserve. You want to be able to,
right.
it's important to, especially in Russia where they kind of have to compete with the Muslim population. I mean, it's not a problem yet, but Russians are only 80% of Russia, ethnic Russians. So they want to try to stay at least 80%, I would think.
Yeah,
But we don't want to be, maybe Japan. It's the size of California and it's mountainous. Maybe 140 million people. Is that what, or
no,
120?
it's less now. It's closer to 120 now. It used to be 130, I think, but it's
Russia's
dropping.
140.
Yeah,
Japan's about 120. Maybe it was 125 a few years ago.
right,
I think that's how it shakes out. I
right.
confused myself a little, but that's a lot of people. I mean, there's
Oh yeah.
40 million people in California.
Yeah, it's super crowded in Japan too. I mean, you never get the
Yeah.
impression that they're disappearing. If you do leave the big cities, though, you do see the countrysides are starting to dwindle in population, and they actually say that's a
But
problem. But this gets to like the whole like socialist kind of mindset, and that like, well, we have these pensions we have to pay for, so therefore we need more people.
mm,
And
I
I
think in the
just,
Japanese
yeah.
case, they've got to compete with. They don't want to get run over by China, so I would think they want to keep their population up
Oh,
to some
come
extent.
on. It's an order of magnitude question here. They're not going to be able to catch up. I mean, and they don't have the
No,
land
not
either.
catch up with them, but Japan that's 110 million people in 50 years might
Yeah,
have
they
a
just
better
their goal is
chance
to
than.
like avoid having their industrial base be Americanized, which is to say, gone to
Outsourced.
China.
Yeah, I mean, they
Yeah.
can do that through just trade policy. And to a certain extent, they actually do that. And they're smart about that. They don't do like Americans do, which they don't put all
Yeah,
of
I
their
mean, they
high
also have
tech
the issue
stuff.
of being like fairly resource poor and
Yeah,
export oriented. So,
yeah.
like, just to buy like the sort of inputs that they would require to deal with their own population, they're kind of forced to become a export power, which means that they're not just worried about like throwing up trade barriers to promote like domestic consumption
That's
of
true.
domestic
They
products.
do need ability to
They
have income to
yeah,
buy.
they
Yeah.
like actually have to have like some like globally competitive
But
some high technology.
to be sort of fair to them, I mean, what are they really buying aside from energy that they absolutely need? They actually are, I think, self-sufficient in rice, and they do it at an incredibly high cost, but they still do it because I think they're wise to do that, frankly, because if you outsource your food production, you truly
Yeah,
are dependent,
it
and that's
a lot of their like industrial base, like it's crazy once you start looking into like how much stuff you need to build other stuff and like how few suppliers there are as you get up the food chain.
yep.
Things like high precision optics, like they make a lot of optics, but then
Hmm.
there's like the machines to like make those.
Yeah.
Then there's the machines to make those machines, and like eventually there's like, one Swiss like company, like 20 people who's making some like
Right.
extremely capital intensive inputs to something. And if you lose access to that because you have no foreign currency to buy that, then your entire industrial base like kind of has some really bad knock-on effects.
That's
Something
true. Yeah, but
something just to harken back a little from a little earlier is talking about this national policy stuff, and especially with Man in the High Castle, is I've thought about, which goes back to, I can't remember who was saying, talking about having religion being more propagated in Russia, more pushed by the state, is there's a matter of a nation having a vision, like for what it wants to be, what its ideal, something it's a progress that it's marching toward. And of course, we have a vision. We have a record very clearly of Japan having its vision, and no, even more clearly of the Third Reich having its vision. And the U.S. had a bit of a vision. I know, like in the 50s, it was very like consumerist, but as like, oh, we're going to go to the moon and all this. It was very
yeah, it was also a counterpoint to communism. It was sort of the free world, quote unquote, and it was the leader of that, and we were standing up against
and as time
tyranny and all
goes,
that. And
as
what?
time has gone on,
Yeah.
that vision has become more and more just about like, there's a new iPhone coming out, aren't you excited? There's no more like, you will be a soldier, you can have this great opportunity in life. It's just about buying stuff and
Well,
Yeah.
brands.
yeah. In a unipolar world, as they say, there's not much grand demand to rise up to the occasion.
And if we had more of a vision, any country has a vision for a culture, even a very prosperous one with automation, birth control, long life expectancy, everything. I think that may have some influence on whether people really try to start families or not and have a higher birth rate.
I agree. I agree. I don't know if there was ever any instance in the United States' history where people, they have this slogan in Denmark, do it for Denmark, have kids. But I don't know if there's ever been a time in American history where we had that. I think it was perhaps more on a sort of local level where your church or your community encouraged that thing. But I don't remember any national
Teddy
propaganda.
Roosevelt. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt was pro-natalist.
Really?
I don't know that he really did anything about it, but he like made speeches where he said it was our duty to populate the country so we could have a
Mm.
firm grip on the western states.
Well, yeah. I mean, his sort of circumstances were still kind of firming up control over the frontier to a degree, and so that would make some sense. And there was also, and I'm answering my own question, I guess, but they were also very pro settlement and development of the Midwest when they were having those land grants for specifically European immigrants. And a lot of the Midwest was developed that way, and they had, you can call that a pro-natalist, approach. It was more of a kind of pro-nationalist approach, perhaps, but yeah, they saw these land grants as ways to grow the empire, so to speak. You guys have any closing thoughts? I think we're good on this one.
That's just something that this book represents. So it's looking back in time for one thing, and of course the United States had a stronger vision for the future and progress and like an ideal back in 1962 as well in our regular timeline. But they're looking back at these two powers that got defeated, and one that had an extremely elaborate manifesto for what they wanted to do as a culture that got completely crushed. So the Third Reich is sort of frozen in time like that. We have all their propaganda. We can read all this stuff about it, where they wanted to go, and they were crushed. They were flattened. They were stopped. So that makes it very ripe for a kind of fiction. Oh, they wanted to go to the moon, so they're going to the moon. They're having autobahns, 200-mile-an-hour cars, etc. And it's just like kind of like entropy over time that here in 2016, there's like that momentum is really gone from any high-end country. It's just about buying and selling. There's not a culture like a nationalism anywhere.
Yeah, and it's strange that it's become a little bit of a monoculture.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I guess for like big countries, Central Europe and Eastern Europe, I would say that they still have a sense of themselves and a direction they want to go in. But I mean, you could quibble about whether they're major countries or not.
Sure. Russia today also has a very
Yeah,
nationalistic
Poland and
vision.
Russia and Hungary
Eastern Europe.
come to mind.
Yeah, but the sort of Warsaw Pact countries, they're just too small to kind of factor into anything on a global level. I mean, you basically just have, you have Russia, you have China, and you have America. I mean, I don't know, maybe Britain, but I just don't see it really having much of an impact outside of the Anglosphere, in the media at least. So I guess the vision of globalism versus nationalism, I think those are the two big competing views today versus capitalism and communism. And I think we're living in a capitalist system with globalist tendencies, and I think we're kind of shifting away from that, perhaps.